Good morning, everybody. The things I'm going to cover today are the sterility testing of the newly set up germ-free isolator prior to animal entry. So I'll be expounding on what Frank mentioned to you earlier. Again, attention to detail and what we do at Taconic and how long it takes in general. The quality control of the materials entering the isolator. I'll talk to you a little bit about the food, bedding, all of those things, what we do at Taconic. The microbial monitoring of the isolator after animal entry. Again, I'll go into a little bit more of the microbiology here and exactly what we do, so hopefully it'll all make sense. And then the supplies, I'm going to tell you what we use, and then I also just did some quick searching, to give you alternatives, and I'm sure everybody here probably uses different products from different companies. And back to that too, how many of you guys have access to a microbiology laboratory, or would you be shipping out your samples for testing?
I've done both.
You've done both? Okay. I was just curious which way it was. Okay. Okay. So testing of the new germ-free isolator, the sterility testing. So I'm going to start from where Frank mentioned. Pretty much once you have the isolator all set up, you've got your supplies in, it's been sterilized, you think it's sterilized. What we do at Taconic is 3 weeks of sterility testing. And you have to have 3 weeks of negative results in order to enter your animals into the isolator. So we have this, I'm going to talk to you about something called a mold trap. And I'm not sure if everybody does this or not, but we find it very useful at Taconic. It is the key that finds fungal mold contaminants almost every time if they're in there. I'll tell you a little more about that. So for the week 1 testing, as part of the isolator setup, which Jamie, will you go over this later, the mold trap? Okay. So essentially, it's one of the cages for the animals. We fill it with the autoclaved sterile feed, add water, and it just sits in there for the 3 weeks that we're going to do the sterility monitoring. We put swabs in there, so it just looks like a big bin with food and gamish and then swabs. So then we also take swabs of the interior of the isolator, the floor, the ceiling, the walls, all around, the port, the caging that's already in there, feed, floor area, pretty much anything, excuse me, you can get access to with a swab. You want to do that. And the swabs are going to go into a vial that are going to have water in them. And then you'll also take swabs from the mold trap, ultimately. All of these things go into this sterile vial that then goes to the laboratory. And I'm going to tell you a little bit later about exactly what will happen to it in the laboratory. But we'll do this for week 1, week 2, and week 3. So essentially the same thing over and over again. And each week it'll go to the laboratory for testing, for sterility testing. And I can't emphasize to you enough, because we've seen this happen multiple times. You cannot have sterilant on the swab. For obvious reasons, nothing will grow. So it's really, really important when you collect your samples that you don't have sterilant on the swab. Okay, so the laboratory testing. The vials at Taconic are transported to the quality control laboratory the same day. If for some reason they can't be tested that day, they're discarded and resampled. The reason for that is some of the organisms that you're going to be looking for may not survive overnight. Some of them are anaerobes, so they're going to be exposed to air when they're in the vial. So you wouldn't want to test something where everything's already dead. We will culture them both aerobically and anaerobically. And we also will prepare wet mounts from the liquid in the vial that I told you about. And they will look at that for any kind of organism growth, or not organism itself, not growth. And we also keep the original vial for at least 1 week. The reason for that is you could have a benchtop contaminant, BTC, and mold, or if you have discrepancies and you want to go back and see, because sometimes it's hard to know if it's a benchtop contaminant or if it's something real. And so if you can't reculture it back out of the original vial, then it could be a benchtop contaminant. The other thing we found is we use the cotton-tipped swabs with the wooden applicator stick. Mold tends to love to grow on the applicator stick if it's in there. So it's worth keeping one of those in the vial and just leaving it on the bench for a week and watching that for mold growth as well. What we do, and this is all in SOPs, as Sue Ellen talked about, if we have a suspect finding, meaning we see growth on one of the aerobic or anaerobic plates, it must be confirmed by a second sampling. And the second sampling has to be taken on a separate day. And if you can't confirm that original finding, there has to be an investigation. And these can take many different forms, you know. We also will look at the history of the isolator. Was there any breach? Did anything weird happen? Did a cap fall in? You know, any number of things can happen. So you want to look at the isolator, the log report, talk to the people who work with the isolator. Did anything strange happen? So if you can't confirm it, though, you still have to have another 3 weeks of negative results in order to put animals into that isolator. Any questions about that?
Question. Are you concerned with anything that might take long? Is there anything that might take longer than 3 weeks to come back as positive, and therefore would that 3 week period not be sufficient?
Let's see. I mean, we keep the plates, and I'll talk about this a little later, 72 hours. Generally, anything that's going to grow, you will see within 72 hours. The mold is the one that's kind of dicey, and usually, I mean, that can take up to a week. So 3 weeks of negatives, you should be covering everything. Okay.
That's right. Does this, if you're going to consider viruses alive, does this cover viruses by any chance?
No. And that's something that Frank touched on. Typically, we don't do health testing on germ-free animals. We do the vial testing because the risk is extremely low. These are typically rederived animals. They're sterile. So no, there's no viral testing. And you wouldn't pick it up with this. Okay, quality control of materials entering the isolator. I'm a little bit biased just because of what I've seen happen. I firmly believe that autoclaving is the safest way to get materials into a germ-free isolator. And I'm going to go into just a little bit of what we do. There's 2 types of indicators that you can use for your autoclaving cycles. There's a biological indicator, and I'll show you some pictures of these as we go on. The one we use is Verify. And then there are also chemical indicators. A typical one is a Sterigauge, and I'll show you more about this as we go. And as Frank mentioned, it's very, very important that you validate your autoclave cycles. And I know that depending on where you work, you might have different levels of control over the autoclave. I don't know if you would be running it yourself or if someone else is running it. Typically at Taconic, we have a staff that runs the autoclaves. So when you're validating your cycles and your loads, you're pretty much responsible for doing it yourself. I mean, our autoclaves are, probably a quarter of this room. They're huge. You walk in kind of type. So, and we literally get down to the level of detail where, like, if you use a cylinder, you want to pack the cylinder the same way. You want it to have the exact same things in it every time you run it because you want to know that it's sterile. And you also want to know that the autoclave itself is running properly, so you want to be checking on that. Again, attention to detail. You can't be too careful about the autoclaving. You're going to want to run a biological indicator or more than one in every single load that you do, and we'll talk more about that. I would also run a Sterigauge in every single load that I do because you need to know that it's sterile. Some people use ethylene oxide for sterilizing things to get them into the germ-free isolator. There's Also biological indicators and chemical indicators you can use for that. And for irradiated materials, we do sterility testing on all of our feed. Feed is a particular concern, and we do have some customers that request irradiated feed to go into a germ-free isolator, and we typically will not do that because in our experience, when we culture irradiated feed, we do find contaminants. Usually they're going to be aerobic spore-forming rods, sometimes anaerobic spore-forming rods. The spore formers are very difficult to kill with irradiation, and they can be problematic to kill with autoclaving as well. Sure.
When you're food sampling to culture it,
Mhm.
is there a particular way that you're getting a representative sample, culture the core? Or
Yes, that's an excellent question, and one that we struggle with all the time. Our SOP is set up right now. Basically, a bag of sterile feed would go to the laboratory. They have it in a biological safety cabinet. They make a sterile cut in the bag in 6 different places and pull out pellets from all around the bag, and then that's cultured. But as you say, it's not the entire lot. And that's the problem with irradiation. You're not looking at the entire lot. You're looking at a very small subsection of what was irradiated. And did it all get the same amount of irradiation? We've literally had issues where one bag fails and the next bag passes in the same lot. And so then you can't sterility test every single bag when the feed's $200 a bag, because you can't use it anymore after you open it. So yeah, it turns into a conundrum, especially with irradiated feed, where you can see differences within the same lot, which is why I don't like to use it for germ-free. Okay, as I mentioned, the biological indicators, what we use is Verify. Oh, the picture's blurry. These are called self-contained biological indicators. So what it is a little vial. Inside the vial is a spore strip that's going to have either one of 2 organisms on there. The Bacillus astrophaeus is one of them, and then Geobacillus thermophilus is the other. Notice they're all bacillus. And the one organism we have the most trouble with in germ-free is Bacillus cereus. So the bacillus organisms are used for this for a reason. They're very hard to kill, the spores, extremely hard. So for the Verifies, the little spore strip is inside. You put this in the autoclave with your load, and you want to put it in the most difficult place to get sterilized. So it would be, on the very inside of a container. Sometimes we'll even sacrifice, a bag of feed. It'll be down inside of that, and then wrapped in the paper, and then in the cylinder. When these come out of the autoclave, they go to the lab, and essentially all you do is squish the tube, and it releases the media so that it's in contact with the spore strip. And if it grows, it changes color, and if it doesn't grow, it doesn't change color. So very easy, yes, no. You just need an incubator, and depending on whether you're looking at steam sterilization or ethylene oxide, you incubate it at different temperatures. It's a very good yes, no, and they work very, very well. This is just another brand that I found online, and the different colors, the purple, the red, the brown, are for different types of sterilization. They'll have different spore strips in them. The other product that you'll see a lot of, it's a lot less expensive, but I will tell you it's a pain in the butt, are spore strips. And they come in these little paper wrappers, and same deal, you stick it in your load, autoclave it. The problem that we have with these is the little paper gets wet, and then when you're transporting it to the lab, and then the lab has to get it open inside a biosafety cabinet, you can get contamination. And we have seen it quite a bit. So I would not recommend using these, even though they're like 1/10 the cost. They're gonna cost you a lot of time and effort in the long run with false positives. The chemical indicators that I mentioned, we like to use Steri gauges. These are made by 3M. These are cool. basically there's a little chemical pellet that's in the left end, and based on how much heat and steam you have, it melts and then it runs up and you get a nice little black line, hopefully in the accept area. And then that tells you that the load passed. But they even say on the manufacturer's website that this does not replace the use of a biological indicator. So these are good to use to make sure your autoclave's functioning properly, space them around in your load. They're not that expensive, but don't try to use those in place of a biological indicator. Okay, so we're all the way up to microbial monitoring after you put the animals in. So what do? So at Taconic, for our germ-free isolators, we do weekly microbial monitoring of the germ-frees, and it's very similar to before the animals go in. You swab the interior of the surface, and the only difference in this case is that you use dirty water that has come from, bottles with the animals in there. And again, you swab the whole interior of the isolator, feeders, the floor area. We also will collect fecal samples and little bits of soiled bedding from, usually it's 10 to 12 cages, sort of randomly through, depending on the size of your isolator. And again, we add a little bit more of the water, the dirty water from the other animals, and then this tube looks really nasty and it gets sent to the laboratory. Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by dirty water?
It's from the cages that have animals in it. So, it's their drinking water, so it can get bacteria in it. So in the laboratory, these are cultured aerobically, anaerobically, and then again, we keep the tube to look for mold growth. This is where I said I was going to go into a little bit more detail. We plate them on TSA with blood, which will pretty much grow anything. We also put it on nutrient agar with dextrose. This will grow the more finicky bacteria. Brucella agar is what we use for anaerobic culture. Again, we do the wet mounts every week to look for any bacteria or mold that may be in there. And we keep the original sample for at least a week to go back to, should we need to confirm anything or see if there's a benchtop contaminant. Any questions about this?
How do you store the original sample?
The original sample is just kept on the bench, room temperature. A lot of the bacteria do not like to be cold, so I would not put them in the refrigerator if you want to see anything. Hmm?
Not being a microbiologist,
Sure.
Is there an advantage over the Brucella agar versus the Savarad rod?
No. Yeah. It's, it's your choice. It's just what we use. And the typically, as I said, our biggest problem with germ-free is Bacillus cereus. Okay, transport media. This may or may not apply to you, but I did want to mention it because if you're using an external laboratory for your microbiology testing, you may have to do this. I also found, and I have it on a later slide, there are several companies out there who will do the Verify and other biological indicator monitoring for you. They'll even set up a program where they send it to you to remind you to do it every 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever your parameters are going to be. This is a media which we're in the process of currently testing at Taconic as part of an R&D project. It is supposed to allow the organisms to live up to 72 hours at room temperature, and it's supposed to keep aerobes and anaerobes and microaerophilic organisms viable for that period of time. I mean, as I said to you right now, literally we walk it to the QC lab. It goes from Notobiotics right over there. So if it has to sit, they're discarded. So we don't really utilize this at this point in time, but it's something we're looking at to see if we can preserve viability. And so if you're forced to ship samples, I would look at something like this, but I would validate it and make sure it works for you, by putting something in there, what it is, making sure it survives shipment, just to be sure. Because a lot of things do not work as advertised, as I'm sure you all know. And there are a lot of these, But this is one that in particular I read a lot of really good things about. So in summary, microbial monitoring of a new germ-free isolator, it has to be sterile for at least 3 weeks before you put any animals in. We do QC monitoring of all the supplies. I recommend autoclaving. Again, as we've gone over and over again, it's very important to validate the autoclave cycles, the runs, and how you pack up your loads that are going into the autoclave. And it's also very important to use biological indicators and or chemical indicators. And after you enter the animals into the germ-free isolator, you definitely want to do some type of monitoring. We do weekly monitoring. You may want to do less, more, depending on your project. And the other key thing I just want to hit again, attention to detail. I mean, really, you can't say that enough. The people who work for you, the processes, everything. You have to be so compulsive with this, because one little mistake and your whole project's gone. So it's not worth not going through validating your autoclave loads to save yourself a few days. It just isn't. And the other thing I wanted to say again, because we've had issues, is make sure when you're doing all of the swabbing, you don't get sterilant on the swabs, because you'll have a false sense of security and you may have organisms in there. Let's see. And these are just some of the other laboratories that I found that'll do the independent testing if you need to ship out your samples. And again, you'll have this on the thing. But if you do a Google search, you'll find lots of them, and maybe you can find one close to you.